Hi, my name is Louise Showen-Stark and I look after books on Google Play, and I'm really excited to be working this weekend with the Brisbane Writers Festival to bring you a series of hangouts on air from attending authors. And I'm delighted to welcome today Professor Chris Turney, who has just written a book called 1912, The Year the World Discovered Antarctica. Chris is an Australian-British and British earth scientist. He is the Laureate Fellow for Climate Change at the University of New South Wales. He's written 3 books. 1912 is just the last of his popular science books, and he's been described by the Sunday Times as the new David Livingstone. And having watched a few YouTube clips of Chris out and about in the world, I'm tending to agree with that. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, Louise. Thanks very much.
So my first question is, how did you become attracted to science? What made you become a scientist?
It was just a series of accidental steps that led me here, really. I've always loved travelling, and I always loved trying to understand more about the world. And each step, I just went to another stage in my education. And before I knew it, I was going to Antarctica, working in the tropics, just trying to get some incredible places off the tourist map. And getting paid to work in these marvellous locations.
Sounds rather ideal. So, as an earth scientist, what's the focus of your research?
Well, it's basically past environmental climate change. So we look at the past and we try and get a handle from what happened to the ecosystems, the oceans, the ice, by looking at records in Antarctica, in the tropics with the corals, and we reconstruct, we use nature effectively that's preserved a record of what the environment has done to see what happened when, how quickly things changed, what was the reason for that. I mean, it's just remarkable. You can go into peat bogs in Northern Ireland and dig out ancient trees. You can look at the very fine sediments and buried in them are ancient fossil pollen grains, and you can use that number of different types of pollen grains to reconstruct the ecosystem as well, and if you do layer upon layer going up towards the surface, you can work out what was growing and how quickly these plants and vegetation types moved across the surface.
Wow. So what's been the most exciting thing you've discovered in your research?
Well, truth be known, I was very fortunate. Several years ago, I was actually involved in a team of Australians and Indonesians we were digging a fossil cave site, actually, in Indonesia called Liang Bur. In fact, if you just give me one moment, literally one moment.
I think we're going to see a bit of Indonesia now.
I was very fortunate to work out there with a great team, and they were digging, well, the team was digging for a site, trying to find the route of migration of modern humans into Australia. And the conventional view, the traditional view, is that modern humans evolved in Africa somewhere around 160, 170,000 years ago, and then moved out sometime later. And the best evidence we've got is they got into Australia about 60,000 years ago, and they moved into Europe about 45,000 years ago. So we were trying to find some of the first evidence in the sort of en route. If you had a satellite map or something, and you wanted to move out from Asia into Australia, you'd probably go down to Sumatra, Java, Bali, and then catch a boat across. That would be the sort of ideal scenario. And one of those islands after Bali is Flores, and it's a great location because it's across what they call the Wallace Line. So west of that Wallace Line, just so next to Bali, all the plants and animals are very Asian looking, and then east of that line, it's very Australian. And so Mike Maud, who's an archaeologist at Wollongong at the University of New England, was leading this group, and I was part of that team, trying to find some of the earliest evidence of modern humans moving through. And I've been working on a method to date these ancient fossil remains using carbon dating. We could get back to 60,000 years. So the hope was we'd find some early modern humans and then date them. And instead of finding modern humans, we found something known as Homo floresiensis, or the Hobbit, which looks like a crystal shell. It's a silica gel that's made from it, but they're tiny. They were only 1 meter tall. They're living in the cave with about 9 individuals initially, spanning a period of about 100,000 years. Adults, this is about 37 years old, give or take. tiny skull, less than half a litre, very sloping face and the like, and there were, it caused a huge controversy at the time. I was very fortunate. I did a carbon dating on it, and it was an entirely new species of human. We called it a Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, and long arms and big hips, and probably grunted a lot, and that was probably, I should have really retired after that. That was the best it ever got.
Maybe something else will come up. So you've done quite a bit of interesting work. You worked on a TV series called Man on Earth, which is a British TV series with Baldrick, Tony Robinson. What was that like?
Oh, that was just incredible. Tony was brilliant. I was a science advisor and got interviewed for a couple of episodes, 4 episodes of Channel 4, and it was looking at the impact of past climate change and environmental change on people, right from the dawn of the start of our species in Africa, and then moving out over time towards present day. And I had some work we were doing in the Black Sea, the flooding of the Black Sea, just over 8,000 years ago, and some amazing work had been done a few years before, suggesting that when it flooded, it was perhaps the thing that kick-started the spread of farming across Europe. And we were doing some work on that, and I was very privileged. A TV company flew me out there with Tony, and we had lunch, and they sat in the back of a boat bobbing along in the Black Sea, talking about the latest science. And he was wonderful. He was great fun, Tony.
So moving on to your most recent book, 1912, The Year the World Discovered Antarctica. Why are you so fascinated with the Great Southern Land?
If you're ever privileged enough to go, and I've been very fortunate, I've been twice before, and to South Georgia and the South Atlantic, it's the most stunning landscape, and it's so different to anything I'd ever experienced before. And I think even just the name alone evokes amazing images, and I think one of the first things many of us think about when we hear of Antarctica is the heroic year of exploration. And these amazing characters, Ernest Shackleton, Robert Falcon Scott, Roald Amundsen, and these ripping yarns, these amazing tales, even now, just strike such a chord. But the thing was, because of some of the tragic events surrounding 1912, the death of Scott and 4 of his men, we tend to forget that it was more than just racing to the pole. It was about science. If you opened an atlas more than 100 years ago and looked at the bottom third of the southern hemisphere, it just had a few bits of coastline and a big white space that said unexplored region. No one really knew what was down there. It was the Edwardian equivalent of space exploration. So to get down there and make a bit of a name for yourself, you had to be, if you were an adventurer, you had to do science, because you had to get the stamp of approval from learned institutions to raise the money. And if you're a scientist who wanted to go down there, you were essentially an adventurer. So you had this beautiful moment in time where the two came together. But unlike today, 100 years ago, it was very much a case of the two, you didn't get government funding, you had to be privately funded. So you went after newspaper barons, you raised the public, you did big advertisements, you gave lectures, seminars, you cut newspaper deals, wrote magazine articles, books. Shackleton even made recordings of his voice and what he did and sold those. It was even documentaries, so the first documentaries from Antarctica. And it was just that moment in time, it was almost a heyday of scientific communication. So all of them were going down there, exciting the public because they had to. And what I discovered as I was researching the book was just what an amazing time it was for engaging the public, which we don't really tend to do now. Now we're going down there, we Twitter it in the field with a satellite phone, 140 characters or less. We're setting out what we're doing at the moment on the satellite phone at minus 40 degrees, or we're making video footage of ourselves and loading it up onto YouTube. And that's all great fun, but it's not something that many of us have been doing until recently. The technology allows us to do that. And I thought with 1912, not only did you have the British doing amazing science, and even the Norwegians racing to the pole, you also had the Australians and New Zealanders, led by Douglas Mawson. You had the Japanese, which many people forget about, led by Nobu Shirazi. And then you also had the Germans, led by Wilhelm Filchner. And they were all going out there doing science and exchanging ideas and having ridiculous adventures. I mean, the Germans, I don't know how much you want to chat about this, but there's some great stories of the Germans getting caught in the sea ice. Have we got time to have a chinwag?
Yeah, please do. I'm really interested.
So the whole thing was, when they were going south, they had to try to excite the public as much as possible. And one of the great ways to do that, once you got the stamp of approval to say you were doing science, was to go for a pole. And there's all sorts of poles. There's a South Geographic pole, which is effectively the axis in which our planet rotates. There's the magnetic pole. There's a number of magnetic poles, but the most common one is where the vertical force of the magnetic field is completely vertical, so it points straight down to the ground. But you've got other crazy ones. Have you ever heard of the pole of inaccessibility?
No, but that sounds like the one I want to go to.
It's completely crazy. It's the distance, the furthest distance from anywhere in the coastline. And back in the 50s, when there was this crazy race of everyone trying to claim a bit of Antarctica, the Americans put a base right on the South Geographic Pole, which is now the Amundsen Scott base. But there was also, then the Russians, the Soviets, had to claim something. And so they went to the pole of inaccessibility and dumped these poor guys out there in this small research base, of which they had a sort of chimney stack with a bust of Lenin on the top. And of course, they left after a few years. And over time, the snow's built up, built up, built up. And now, if you go there and you have a look on Google, and you do Google images and just put pole of inaccessibility Antarctica, you'll see this small plinth and this yellow bust of Lenin on its own, just looking at her from the expanse of nothing. Completely crazy.
It does sound a little bit like space exploration, where you think you might run into Neil Armstrong's shoe on the moon, because no one's ever bothered to tidy up.
That's right. And if the aliens ever land there, God knows what they'll think.
So some of the discoveries that were made back in 1912, are they still relevant in science today?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, Wilhelm Filchner is a great example. He got his expedition funded by the lottery, and they went south in the Deutschland, and as they went south from Germany down to the Weddell Sea, the bottom end of the Atlantic, they made temperature and salty measurements through the ocean all the way to the seabed. And that was almost the first point at which we learned that the ocean circulated, the Atlantic circulated like a conveyor belt, and the Antarctic part of it was an important feeder for how the whole thing actually circulated. We didn't know that really before. The Germans were the first ones to do that. And as they went south, they went into South Georgia and then pushed on from there into the Weddell Sea. Now, Filchner had actually met up with Scott in London, and in fact, he'd waved Scott off at Waterloo Station. And they'd met and exchanged ideas. They agreed if they met at the pole, they would swap colleagues and carry on their own way. And Scott even gave him the designs for his motorized sledges. And so the idea was that you could actually then transport material across Antarctica a lot quicker. So they were really incredibly collegial times. But when he got down into the Weddell Sea, they couldn't get out, and they got trapped. And they had this, poor old Filchner had this mad syphilitic captain called Captain Vassal, and who was dumped on him basically. And it was a real Lord of the Flies thing. As they were coming down, they were hoping to build a research base, hold up in winter, and then the following summer, when the lights came back up, they pushed onto the South Pole. And they saw this ice block, and they said, oh, Vassal said, look, we'll build our station on that. And Filchner said, oh, I'm not so sure, it looks a bit dodgy to me. He said, go and ask the Norwegian ice pilot who was on board. And Vassal disappeared, and a few minutes later he came back and said, yes, it's all good, you should do that. And so they started building this big wooden hut. They took horses, which the British had encouraged them to take, put all their supplies on. And as they were doing it, Filchner ran into Vassal, into the Norwegian pilot, and said, oh, what do you think? This looks really good, doesn't it? And he said, I don't think this is a good idea. We shouldn't be here. I always said it was a bad idea. And Filchner was furious, and he went to the captain, Vassal, and said, what's going on? And Vassal said, it's outrageous. Don't believe that Norwegian. Who do you believe, me or him? And Filchner realised he'd been done. And then shortly after the whole hut had been built, the ice just collapsed into the ocean and tore off, hut and all. So we had to chase after it, get the hut off, get the horses off. It was a complete fiasco. And no matter how hard they tried to set up another base, they just couldn't do it. And they tried to get out. And they got locked in the sea ice. So if you've maybe familiar with Shackleton's story of the Endurance or South, where they got locked in the sea ice and tragically the ship sank. The Deutschland ran into a similar situation, but beforehand. And they were locked in the sea ice for 8 months. And even then, they were out there and they were digging holes through the ice and measuring the ocean below them. They had weather balloons and they put them up into the sky and measured the temperature and the atmospheric pressure and the wind direction. So we were observing the whole time the magnetic field as well. But things went from bad to worse. So drunkenness, suspected poisoning, people took shots at one another. And in spite of the fact that all these books that were produced after these expeditions, and the Germans were a classic example, they all sound like they got on really well. Everyone was happy, it was a really good thing. Filcher writes, you know, I think you should have mineral water, the odd bit of fruit juice, the occasional tipple of drink should be good. They were drunk huge amounts of the time, threatening each other with duels. And then, of course, the syphilitic captain, poor Vassal, dies, and they bury his body at sea, and Filcher put someone else in charge, and if anything, the conditions got even worse. And towards the end, Filcher writes in his diary, which has since become available, he said, last night, I slept on the floor with my rifle and cartridges in case Dr. Van Girdel next door tried to shoot me through the wall. It was completely imploded. But shouldn't laugh, really. It was a dreadful situation to be in. And then they got us down to South Georgia, and effectively it was a mutinous crew. The head of the police came on board British and said, look, do you want me to help break things up? And Filcher was saying, no, it will look bad back in Germany. And in the end, he had to disband the whole expedition. It was a real shame, because if they kept themselves together, I mean, the scientific outputs they produced were remarkable, really incredible. And if they'd only pulled together, it could have been phenomenal. But yes,
and so the things they discovered, you're still using that information now.
Yeah, very much so. And well, we've been working a lot on the Australian expedition data, and comparing the great thing was, because they were down there for so long, the Molsons expedition was extraordinary. They left. He was 28 years old. He'd already been south of Shackleton. He got to the area of the South Magnetic Pole. He decided he wanted to lead his own expedition south. Scott had tried to convince him to come with him. Mawson said, no, it's scientifically it's not good enough. I want to do something different. And basically set off with the aim of having a whole series of research stations across Antarctica. Off the map, they didn't really know where they were going. They said, oh, somewhere around there we'll put a base. But they didn't know. And they took one base to Macquarie Island. They came from Hobart, Macquarie Island. They set up a wireless station there to act as a relay station. And the team stayed there and did all these scientific observations of geology, temperature in the oceans, the atmosphere, mapping, a whole range of things. And then pushed on south with the Aurora and got all the way down and put one base down on what we now know as Cape Denison, Commonwealth Bay. And that's where Mawson stayed. And then the rest of the team were due to go only about 500 miles to the west, and ended up going, well, I'm mixing my units here, about 2,500 kilometers to the west. They couldn't find anywhere to land. So you had these 3 bases strung out, making measurements all the time. And it was just incredible. Mawson ended up setting up his base in the windiest place in the world. Average wind speeds were 70 kilometers an hour. And if you have a look on the National Film and Sound Archive, there's a link from my website, christurney.com. You can see some of the movie footage of these guys working in these, well, Mawson described as home of the blizzard, which was very much the case. It was incredible. And one of the things he was really keen to do, the idea was that people had spotted since the mid-19th century that a lot of the plants and animals across the southern continent, in South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, were very similar. And so was a lot of the geology. And this led to the concept, this idea that they'd all been connected somehow by these sort of land bridges, these big chains of land that linked up probably somewhere near Antarctica, where all the plants and animals could migrate across. And then some point later, they'd all sunk below the waves, very much a bit like Atlantis. And that was one of the reasons why Mawson was keen to go south of Shackleton a few years before. So in 1912, when he had his own expedition, he actually had his ship, the Aurora, with an amazing captain called John Davis. When he wasn't going to visit the expedition bases, he had separate trips making sounding measurements on the Southern Ocean, trying to see if they could find the land bridge. And they couldn't find it anywhere, and they didn't understand why that was the case. And of course, it was all before plate tectonics. So all these ideas and concepts, they were testing the very limits of our planet, trying to work out how they could explain the world around it. So, I mean, and the other lovely thing was Scott's expedition has inspired us to do all sorts of work, and one of which was trying to understand climate change in Antarctica. And that was what led us, for a wonderful group called Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions, to fly us to the South Geographic Pole. And we were doing work at the South Pole, 100 years to the day when Scott arrived at the South Pole. So we were drilling, collecting ice and snow samples, and then someone had organised a cricket match. I haven't played cricket for 20 years. We're at 3,000 metres, or just below 3,000 metres above sea level, and my lungs were heaving. And I went in, I played for a British team and got the winning runs, and then probably collapsed. And then we had a memorial service afterwards, which was really moving. It was absolutely stunning. It was a beautiful blue, crisp day, and there was a light flurry of snow around our feet, and it was just beautiful to watch out that vast expanse of snow and ice and realise that actually, excluding the research station behind us, it hadn't really changed at all in 100 years.
That's amazing. And going there now is not the same. It's much safer. Although there's still the elements, it's still a wild place, isn't it? Just lost sound a little bit.
Yeah, health and safety wise, yes, absolutely. The weather can change on a moment. Oh, sorry, it did break up a bit there, didn't it?
We did break up a little bit. That's okay. We're good to go again.
Yeah, okay. That's okay. Sorry, beg your pardon. So, yeah, I mean, the weather can change at the moment. Well, one of the things we're very fortunate to do is that we can fly into a lot of these locations, and that's brilliant. So in 4 or 5 hours, you can be in Antarctica, especially from South America. But other places, I mean, we did field work in South Georgia, and there's no airport there, there's no airstrip, so you have to get a boat, which is a fishery protection vessel called the Faris, and it's run by the South Georgian government. It goes out of the Falkland Islands. It takes 4 days on a boat, going backwards and forwards, 40 degrees, so you've got to have a steady stomach, or at least try and keep your breakfast down. And so that's probably the closest I ever came to travelling as the old guard really did, but it's still a breathtaking place.
So I wanted to ask you as well, there are so many young people who are thinking about what they want to do with their lives, and what would you say to convince a young person with an inquiring mind to pursue a career in science?
It's just one of the most exciting things you can do. You can go and see, I mean, I'm very fortunate as an earth scientist in particular. I get to travel and see remarkable parts of the world. You're almost your own boss. You come up with ideas, you write your research grants, you write your papers up to excite the public and your colleagues, and you can go almost anywhere you want. Sorry, excuse me. But one of the greatest things I was advised early on as a student was not to specialise too early. Keep your options as broad as possible, so that when you do get to the age where you have to make a decision, you've got as many choices on the table as possible. And I was very fortunate to be given that advice.
And if there's someone at home watching now who wants to do something about and discover something about the Earth, what's something really simple they could do right now?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of wonderful things online now that you can do. We talk about community science, we talk about reaching out. The internet's changed things so much. There's all sorts of initiatives and programs where you can help science already. If you're at home, you can do things. There's oldweather.org, which is a fantastic one. That's a lovely example. That's one run out where they've taken old British naval logs, and a lot of them have been scanned. It's amazing. While they're fighting these sea battles, there's some poor sap 100 years ago or so who was out there with a bucket, dropping it over the side and measuring the temperature. Shrapnel's flying everywhere. And all these things were scanned, and they're all done in a beautiful military way, so they're all done to exactly the same format. And so these have been scanned, but the big help that these guys need is actually someone to transcribe them. So you can go on, you can do your training course, and you can help fill in the numbers. And these ships, a lot of them went all over the world. And of course, the British weren't just the only ones. Chileans, Japanese, the Americans. So all these things that are pulling all these fantastic data sets together, which the society, the internet is allowing science to actually do. I mean, there's other things as well. There's Earthwatch, Operation Rally. If you want to get out in the field and you haven't got any formal scientific training, a lot of scientists say, look, I need help to do X project. Will you come along? You can have a sort of holiday where you help people do science as well. So there's lots of other opportunities out there. If you're not necessarily interested in training, you can still do all these amazing things.
So the internet age might be a new age of discovery with a broad popular appeal of people contributing and joining in.
Yeah, absolutely, which we never had before. It was quite an exclusive club, and you needed years of training. But with the sort of technologies we've had now, we can reach out to the public in a way we never did. So, you know, using all these Twitter, YouTube movies as well, that helps. And with people having really good internet access at home, broadband, you know, big files or running in the background a computer climate model or whatever, you can do at home, and it's all helping, which is fantastic. But if we were trying to budget into our research grant, we'd blow the national debt.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, I would like to ask you, what's next? What's the next project, the next adventure?
Oh, well, we're off to Antarctica in November, but we're currently just putting together a grant, a proposal. If you have a look on the website, christurney.com, we're trying to put forward an Australasian Antarctic expedition for 2013-14. So it's inspired by Molsons, the Douglas Molsons expedition, and we're trying to get a group of scientists and benefactors together to take an ice-strengthened vessel down to a part of Antarctica that's not really been explored for 50, 60 years. We'll go down for 9 weeks and go and explore, make observations of the oceans as we go, and then look at the wildlife when we get down there. We're going down to a place called Enderby Land, and there's a map showing you the locations and contact details. And if people are interested in being involved, or any rich benefactors out there who are keen to get involved to come to Antarctica with us, you'd be most welcome.
Oh, I wish I was rich. I'd love to come. Thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned earlier, Professor Chris Turney's books are available on Google Play right now. You will love reading 1912. It's a rip-roaring adventure story, and if you don't love science after that, then you have a heart of stone. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Louise. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.